is a lecturer here at the Institute, once a modern foreign languages teacher in secondary education, then for almost 20 years, a tutor and researcher in primary teacher education, on which experience she draws when writing on foreign language pedagogy and philosophy of education. Paula is now writing a thesis on the nature of photographic images and moral questions about how these are distributed, viewed, and otherwise used. Coming from San Diego, Paula arrived in the United Kingdom in 1988.
Santiago, Chile.
Say again?
Santiago, Chile.
That's how I should have pronounced it. Experience of very different educational systems has helped her to reflect on the continuing nature of empire, British and Spanish, on social and educational identities. Tonight's subject, the languages we speak and the empires we embrace, addressing decolonization through the gaze of the empire.
Thank you very much, John. That video you saw there is a video I usually use with my students when we talk about decoding Spanish. And I've been using that video for about 7 years or so. And it's only been in the last 3 years that I realized that everybody in that video was white. And I thought, how am I using this? How have I not noticed that? It was always there. It was just my north had changed in some way. So in this talk, I look about the differences between decolonization and the imperial values that we have. And I'm suggesting, my argument is that we cannot decolonize in the home of the empire, because it sets us off on a fool's errand in a way. So what happened is that when we decolonize in the colonies, if you take away the word decolonization, then of course the shadow will disappear. But what happens when you take away decolonization in England? The imperial values are still there. So that's one of the things that struck me. Why is it all this talk about decolonization? And yes, these problems persist. Just a little thing I'm going to share with you. When I was 15 years old, I had a dream. And in my dream, I was a British explorer. I was a man. And I was in Africa. And I was the first white man in Africa. And I saw this tribe of people and I thought, I'm going to civilize them. I'm going to bring all this wealth that I have and I'm going to make their lives better. And so I did. And then 100 years passed in the dream. And I was, again, myself somehow facing this tribe, but there were also white people there as well, which had been born there. So, they were kind of colonizers, but I was still that British explorer. And they were going at me. It was basically like a mob. They were going to lynch me because I had destroyed their civilization. And I knew that they were right. In my dream, I knew that they were right. And I was so scared. I ran for my life. I got into a jeep and I ran off until I reached the edge of a cliff, a bit like that one in the dream. And but there was nowhere else to run. So I get out of the jeep and the people were still there and they were going to kill me. And I thought there's nowhere for me to do, nothing for me to do. So I grabbed my gun and I went to shoot myself. And one of the guys there says, don't do that. He says, there's only one thing in a man's mind before he kills himself. And he was about to tell me when I hear my father, Paula, time for school. And I never got to know the answer to that. And it's always backed me. And when I was writing this article, this essay, I began to think, well, I'm actually perhaps beginning to answer that question. What is it that is troubling me after, I've never been to Africa, but the parallels are similar with South America, which is my context. It's possible that I may have watched a film or something that inspired that, but that dream always stayed with me. And dreams have always been part of my life. And it's part of my perhaps South American heritage. Okay, so in this talk, I'm addressing these 3 issues. And but I'm also exemplifying them with these other ones, okay? So looking at what does the empire mean and the difference between the empire and the colony and why I think we cannot decolonize in the home of the empire and how this works through the gaze of the empire. So first a bit on researcher identity. As I said, I come from Santiago de Chile. And when I presented my paper to Job, one of the comments was that it wasn't always clear when I used the word we, whether I was referring to we in England or we in South America. And I thought to myself, well, that's actually a good point. Who am I referring to? Because when I'm right, I'm thinking I feel part of Britain. I feel like, you know, I'm writing from the context of being a teacher here. But I'm also aware that I'm not one of them, okay? Even though I may feel that I am, you know, a British citizen, I know that not everybody sees me in that way. So in this presentation, what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be looking at, showing you some slides which complement what I am saying. And I'm also reading parts of my text. So at times I use my own language and identity background, examining how these problematize each other in the present context. The problem arises when I use we to refer to those in the place where I have taught and lived for over 30 years, and the we to reflect my being originally from a colonized culture. I could say that I am addressing you from the we that comes from my experience of having once been a foreign language teacher, of being a parent in the UK, I haven't had a child here. But equally, I could say that, well, I mean, those things, having lived here for over 30 years, it puts me at the service of the empire in many ways. But I could equally say that I'm addressing you from the we that allowed me to pay particular attention to these issues. That is to say, the we that makes me a hybrid individual and that often puts me at the receiving end of colonial and post-colonial attitudes and initiatives. So for clarity of argument, it seems necessary that I pick a side. But that wouldn't reflect the complexity of the issue, because I am clearly we and they. But maybe not so clearly, because the fact that I feel at home in both instances does not make me one of us in the eyes of UK empire. And I've been made to feel that at times. So I try to use we and they judiciously. But if I don't always succeed, it's because it's really difficult in the home of the empire not to take sides. So I'm just going to share with you my DNA. You know, and if you look at my DNA there, where would you put me in the countless forms I've had to fill in of my ethnicity? Or would you have to look at me to put me somewhere? Or would you have to hear me to put me somewhere? I have never thought of myself as white until I came to England. You know, I would never have put myself as white. I put myself as whitish. But it's obvious when I'm in England that some people do see me as white. So where is my place? And how does that benefit the institution that I take myself as an ethnic minority? So how much of me is a conflict? You saw in the video, you know, the conquest of paradise. And I think that conquest is still happening inside me, or is awakened lately inside me. So what then does it mean that we unquestionably teach and embrace the languages of empire, as I've grown to love the language of empire as well? You may be familiar with this film, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Wearing and Love the Bomb. So for me, that resonated because it's a little bit something that happened to me. For instance, in there, it says nuclear warhead, handled with care. And there is a nuclear warhead. So it's about this guy who learns to love the bomb and can't let go of it. But I turned this into something that actually reflects my position. So how I stopped worrying about the horrors of conquest and invasion and learned to love Spanish. There are so many things about Spanish culture that are worth loving and that I have come to love. But it's very difficult to sometimes disentangle these things from issues of decolonization. So although in the eyes of the empire, although only the elites, I'm going to put that one there, not working right. Only the elites benefited both at home and in the colonies. The harm done by empires to indigenous populations was devastating and linguistically tragic. So we have here, for instance, this is some of the things that happened, you know. the people in the Bahamas area, the first to suffer the conflicts, forced conversions, and the epidemics that characterized the conquest. In some parts of South America, over 90% of the population died, which is an incredible number. But actually, it wasn't always like that. But we have learned to think that certain things have died or disappeared, or simply that they never were. So this has led me to review my own philosophical story, so to speak, and ask myself why I'm here at all, training teachers in a British university to teach Spanish. Should it have been different otherwise for me? Because had it not been for the conquistadors taking Spanish to the Americas, I wouldn't be here now. But to wish the conquistadors away is to wish myself away. I am here because of the tragedy of their being there. The conquest continues. And right, to the next slide, I think. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework in terms of where am I placing the gaze of the empire as Foucault conceptualizes. So in Discipline and Punish, Michael Foucault develops the idea of the Enlightenment in Europe as an age of coercion by means of observation. The newly found power of science over nature became the potential control of the human, classifying and defining people according to absurd behavior. To fall outside expected norms was hence described as to be bad or wanting, criminal or mad, etc. Social norms or expectations around human behavior were particularly arbitrary and dependent on the institutions that made them at times. So to succeed, empires needed the kind of order and discipline that guaranteed their survival, dominion, and expansion. The gaze of the empire was thus embodied first in the gaze of its own people at home, towards the object outside of it. The imperial notion of Britishness entailed mainly not being the exotic other, not being the imperial other of France or Spain. And second, in the gaze of the colonizer, who becomes the immediate channel of power for the empire abroad, the conquistador par excellence, the first and last panopticon guard on duty. Now, I have an instance here of the British Empire, but what I'm talking about is applicable to any empire. So whether it's the British Empire or the Inca Empire, there is something morally that we can object about the idea of empire generally. So let's have a look at these, the ideas that Foucault had. I'm sure you're very familiar with the panopticon and the idea that you have this prison where all the prisoners are in the cells, and there's a guard in the central tower that can keep an eye on everybody at any given time. So everybody feels observed. The idea is exemplified in that, and it's actually based on the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And Foucault describes him as one of the most exemplary inventors of technologies of power. Thus, the gaze always checks our behavior and ultimately even our intentions, for we scrutinize ourselves to remain within the norm. In other words, anyone's gaze is a potential arbiter of our conduct, the gaze of those in power or the gaze of its sympathizers in power by proxy. And you may have seen these days the way the layers of IOE is very open. Everybody is on each other's gaze these days. So the gaze becomes a specialized and weaponized instrument of coercion and power, and its effects are, Foucault suggests, the ultimate possession. The gaze, which is anything but passive, entails, as Panos observed, a reifying oversight, which by putting everything and every time it sees, the spatial and the temporal, in its proper place, it constitutes an action, implicates itself essentially in the disciplinary imperial project, rendering the imperial essence invisible. So norms and political ideologies function accordingly. The values that needed to be maintained and encouraged were values that served the empire. For instance, competition, ambition, growth, ruthlessness or ruse, adventure and risk, neoliberal standards today. Every new technology was put at its service. Every discovery or invention, whether abstract or concrete, served the values of the empire first, through its finer channels, intellectual, highly or poorly educated. So my argument posits that the colonial gaze, when used within the home of empires, it occludes the factors that sustain what is termed colonial attitudes at home and is therefore inadequate to address issues of decolonization within post-imperial nations. The gaze of the empire is, I claim, what feeds the colonial gaze. In this sense, the former provides a perspective on the latter, allowing us to focus on the source of the values that occasion certain injustices, not only the injustices themselves. This is an actual example of a panopticon that was built in Cuba. There's another one in the United States somewhere. It was it stopped being used in the 60s, but you can see how horrible it is. Okay, so after that first imperial gaze comes, I suggest, the gaze of the colonizer. The colonial gaze differs in that its executor is a native of the colony, whether direct descendant, hybrid, or indigenous. Even if the values maintained in the colony were still those of the empire, the parameters of action were more modest, though no less ambitious, more immediate, and comprised a variety of voices, including that of the indigenous elites. Most importantly, the colonial gaze is constantly transformed by the cultures it encounters. Its possibilities are different through the acquisition of new vocabulary. For instance, regarding the observation of nature, some indigenous language contain concepts that have no equivalent in English. What cannot be translated cannot be observed. It has no language. And without language, there is no possibility of abstraction or control. The gaze of the empire was blind to certain aspects of indigenous culture. The colonial gaze, however, had a greater sense of something existing beyond their immediate comprehension, for the descendants of the first colonizers were in situ and confronted by their own and their indigenous people's daily lives. Thus, the here and now of the colony had very different concerns than those of the empire at home, and that's still the case. The colonial gaze is, therefore, a colonial concern. A myriad of subsequent mixed ethnicities continues to inhabit that complex, multifaceted colonial gaze, that guardianship, as if that gaze had always been their own, even in the physical absence of the empire, until the post-colonial moment when they realized that the gaze never was, or that it was only theirs in part. Such communities or new nations can challenge the colonial gaze, even bring down their statues. But what happens in the home of the empire is something altogether different. Bringing down statues in the home of the empire encounters great opposition. I cannot bring down what makes me fundamentally me, or at least, if I attempt to do it, I need to know what it is that I really am. England, France, Spain, and the rest are not colonies to be decolonized. They are empires still to be de-imperialized. Any attempt at decolonization in the home of the empire is only an attempt at dealing with otherness, not with itself. The term colonial sets us off already on a wrong turn, for it brings to mind what happens or happens somewhere else, to others. And these words matter. So, Foucault says there is always a single individual capable of sustaining hegemony on behalf of the core values of power, what I call imperial values for the purpose of this discussion. Those values have aided the expansion of empires and answered to the need for constant growth, accumulation, and control. So one such an example is this. For instance, this is a region of Chile, Arauco is called, and perhaps the conquistadors sometime saw this and they saw an empty place. Okay, so when we look at the geographical aspect of the colonial gaze, how the colonizers saw and understood the space, for instance, able to see fully populated spaces as empty, because the way indigenous people used the land was very different to the way a European used the land. In Chile, by the end of the 19th century, the colonial state organized town schools for the small southern mixed communities, expecting Mapuche. The Mapuche is the name of the indigenous community. The Mapuche children were expected to join and be educated out, literally, of their own culture. Mapuche people did not live in nor accepted the concept of towns as such. They saw the land, which is Pachamama, as their boundless home. Western empires did not understand this geospatial perspective. Through the newly formed states, the language, therefore, of empire was used to consolidate its gaze. And in her eulogy to the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, where she grew up, Bell Hooks speaks of a community that, like the indigenous people among them, grew up with the wilderness of nature inside them, untamed. She adds, living in the Kentucky hills was where I first learned the importance of being wild. Such importance, I claim, sits in opposition to the ideals of the enlightened empire, where every move is a move towards the control of nature, the taming of the wilderness and of people. What remains wild in the eyes of the empire is where the empire absents itself. We have also euphemisms of power, because they say that the empire is a thing of the past, that now this is a neoliberal state. But what's happened in the past is that we have different ways of doing the same things. We give them different names. So slavery became indentured servants, which actually was just another form of slavery. From empire to neoliberal nation, from colonies to commonwealth. I consider colony is not the same as a commonwealth, but by changing the name, you also hide elements that still persist from the colony. And from subjects to citizens. As an aside, when I got my British passport here, I was asked to swear allegiance to the Queen in 1997. In front of a solicitor, and I had to put my hand on a Bible and swear allegiance to the Queen. And it was a great relief for me to have a British passport, because that meant that every time I came in and out of England, I wasn't going to be confronted by the gaze of the immigration officer, who always said something smirked to me, and nobody else could hear it, only I could hear it. So it was empowering having a British passport. Equally, we might be very familiar with some of these micro-punishment that Foucault talks about. When we begin to create rules as a society, of course, those rules have penalty if you don't do what is expected. And some of these things are right. There are things that there is plenty to be said about our behavior. We don't want to be impolite. And I think all these values of empire in itself, or the values of a nation, there is nothing wrong with them until they think themselves better than other people's values. As themselves, there is nothing wrong with them as such, but we need to be aware that there they are. So empires didn't relinquish this power with the advent of democracy. They simply accommodated themselves to the new terms. So what is the empire and what does the empire want? In particular in higher education, which is my concern here. So there is pride and steadfastness. The gaze of the empire is instantiated academically by Western tenets of excellence. So we have here, for instance, standards of excellence or good practice, it is claimed, is how we approach equity and equality. So who could possibly be against it? Okay, so we already start from a position of power. You could not possibly be against it, so there is no comeback from you. Guidelines are rigorous, fair, and objective. Thus, the act of judgment is not personal. So if I say I'm a hard marker, some people take pride in being a hard marker. What does that mean? Shouldn't it be a fair marker, perhaps? And of course, you depersonalize it. Once you're acting on behalf of something more powerful, then you can do pretty much anything because it's not really you. You're following the guidelines, you're following the standards. Those who fall outside such values are, of course, reprimanded. And Foucault observes here, micro penalties, things that you're called unapplied, disorganized, dogmatic, unreflective, etc. And in some cases, even lazy. And isn't it funny how these are also the adjectives we would apply to children? So we call children all these things, perhaps dogmatic, not so much, but the others we do. So when we do write an essay and it is disorganized, there's a way we can approach that. Do we need to say to that person, you are disorganized? Because these are micro penalties in words and language. And of course, on the other side of that, if you do really well, what does the empire do? It gives you your due praise. So you get an OBE or an MBE. Now, people might think it doesn't matter. There was actually a movement about 30 years ago to change the name of this, but it got nowhere. So you are rewarded, and it's right that we should be rewarded. But do we need to be rewarded on behalf of the empire? What message is that sending? I would have loved to have got an OBE, but I wouldn't now. But before, in my old mentality, I thought that's the peak of everything, right? So the case of the empire, universities, as institutions of power, universities work within a post-imperial framework of traditional expectations of excellence, accumulation of knowledge and resources, selective processes, etc., reflected, among other things, in how they expect students and staff to speak, pronunciation, how they ought to write, spelling and syntax, and how they should structure and present their thoughts and ideas. And that's absolutely right. Like I said, it's not a real problem with that in itself until it believes itself to be superior to other ways of expression. So funds of knowledge, for instance, an approach that's been widely adopted but also critiqued, is an attempt in schools has been used to shift definitions of academic success. And I think such a daring approach wouldn't be out of place in higher education. It's been contemplated as a culturally responsive pedagogy by Rios Aguilar. Now, at this stage, power is not, I think, given those things, but here, expectations can be oppressive to anyone from a disadvantaged background, but particularly so to non-white ethnic minorities. You won't believe it, but today already there were 2 incidents where I could easily apply this thing that happened to me today and to somebody else here. So these things are not just hidden, they are hidden from those who don't know how to look at them. Another comment I had on when I submitted my article was this binary issue. You know, you're talking in binaries, and sometimes it's not a good thing to do. You know, we want to be more less black and white. But I believe that there is an element of binarism in our gaze. Physiologically, we can only pay attention to one thing at any one time. We cannot see 2 things at the same time. We can be thinking about something, but if you're talking to somebody, you're talking to that one person. You're not talking to the whole group. Okay. I can, for instance, now I am addressing you as a group, but it's me and one other thing. It's not me communicating. I cannot split myself. It's only from one position to another, whether that other is one or more. And this is necessarily so because the gaze needs to be personal. If it's not personal, it loses power. And remember that the panopticon, that's what made it effective. Anybody could be observed at any time. If that's not personal, then that loses track. This is why it's effective. There is no hiding from the one that is or potentially could be observing me. Success and failure, therefore, are always felt as personal. Individual decisions and others' academic or practical performance are thus backed by the gaze that claims to adhere to set standards of excellence. However, you know, the one thing is the personal experience, and it's really difficult sometimes to talk about decolonization in institutions because people often say, yeah, but don't take it personally and don't make it personal. But if it's not personal, then what is it? To suppress one's personal experience achieves only superficial or ineffectual change for the institution. It is pointless to wish myself away, you know, if I go on about the conquistadors, but it's not pointless to ask myself why. It may be useful to the institution to see me as an ethnic minority. I've often wondered that because for some people, I am not an ethnic minority, but it is useful for the institution to see me as one, for their numbers, I imagine. For others, I'm clearly not a representative of an ethnic minority. It is not pointless either to ask why I'm here, why the language of an empire is being taught to the children of another empire. And here, for instance, we're talking about the language of empire and powerful instruments. When we think about how language is used and which language is being used and how it matters and how we negotiate group membership, how we exclude or include others through the use of our language, the words that we use, and how our verbal narratives, you know, is part of our identity and the words that we use. This, for instance, is a website about learning Spanish. You know, it says the world in your hands. Okay. Here's a map, and you might think it's a map of the Spanish Empire, but it's actually a map of where Spanish is spoken. But what is the difference between where Spanish is spoken and the Spanish Empire map? Got something similar for France. So you got here where the French Empire was. So these things are displayed in classrooms. So children get to know about these things. And one of the relevant places where, in fact, the discourse around decolonization can occur is the foreign language learning context, particularly in respect to training to teach. And the title of this paper is dedicated to it. So I have been involved in teacher education and foreign language pedagogies for almost 20 years, and the languages we embrace do say something about the gazes we hold dear. What does it mean to teach and learn the language of our own or other people's past and present oppressors? Language carries the gaze that needs to be stealthily disseminated by any invading empire, as it sets the parameters of thoughts and action. It declares what is possible, what is valid, knowledge, and what is not. As such, I argue, speaking the language of empire, English, Spanish, or French, or other, is a mode of sustaining hegemony, nurturing organized systems of power, knowledge, and identity that benefit post-imperial nations in the new and innocuous Western guise of democratic neoliberal nation states. For example, Fabian observed how the use of French in Congolese children's education was a vehicle towards the future of a profitable but dependent colony. Equally, the education of indigenous people received from empires was always an effort to support and expand the empire's oversight over them. In 1531, the conquistadors brought Spanish teachers and nuns in an effort to educate the female indigenous population, while Portuguese and Spanish missionaries and administrators were encouraged to learn the language. But it was a pragmatic move. For example, the real reason for those things was to concern their own interests around Catholicism, tax collection, and forced labor. It did nothing in terms of valorizing the indigenous languages. We've been raised to believe, both in the home of the empire and at home in the colonies, in Western conceptions of excellence and knowledge that construct the world geographically, culturally, and politically by division. Nation states, for instance, by classification, developing world, race, mixed, etc., and by dualism that separate mind from world in the Cartesian sense, nature, nurture, objective, subjective, material, spiritual. Thus, it seems counterintuitive to us not to seek measurable excellence in our accumulation of knowledge. And the more atomized that knowledge is, the easier it seems to us to measure, control, and usage, and its language implicit in the gaze as instruments of power over others. For instance, if you're going to be teaching a language, which language should you be teaching? Seen from a Western perspective, should we be teaching Spanish and French in schools? It might seem absurd to ask that question. Why challenge or endanger our very position as English, French, or Spanish foreign language teachers? But this is the very thought I want to explore, because it is inseparable from our gaze and our sense of identity, two aspects that are inseparable from issues of decolonization. The language we decide to teach matters just as much as the concepts we employ in the process, for our conclusions are always an artifact of our methods. It is highly unlikely that we will ever teach Aztec or Inca languages in Western curricula. But if we are to use Spanish, then whose Spanish are we going to use? Because there are different pronunciations. There is a Spanish, there is the Argentina, there is a Central American pronunciation of this. So in Spain, they say me llamo. In Argentina, they say me llamo. In Cuba, they say me llamo. Which one are we going to teach? And I know some schools, they say, no, it has to be Spanish from Spain. So these are one of the ways, for instance, that we can think about those things. And I think that perhaps the foreign language context is both a relevant and a hostile place to challenge the gaze of the empire. European empires may see no reason to relinquish power within their confines. They use the very attributes of past empires to entice students, inspiring language learners with the best of what those Western empires have accumulated, including whole continents. So, learn Spanish and South America is yours. Now, there will always be benign and admirable reasons to learn other languages, even post-imperial ones. The Western thought disseminated by empires is only an issue when it believes itself superior to others. I couldn't stress that enough. It's only an issue when it believes itself superior to others. In itself, there is no problem with it. I am a firm believer in the access to different ways of being that engagement with foreign literature can give us. Each empire has its own culture. However, worthwhile as a pursuit as this is, markers of the intrusion of empire are still manifest. Why, for instance, is the experience of the world of indigenous peoples often portrayed in post-colonial literature in the form of magical realism. In a critical review of the literature on anthropological magical realism, Chowdhury observes how this genre has experienced criticism in terms of its imperial connotations. Thus, being born in South America in the case of Garcia Marquez is not an automatic ticket to understanding or expressing indigenous value systems. Both writers have an already Western perspective, as I do, acquired through parents and their colonial communities, ways of thinking that I am not certain are possible to shake. Contemporary authors who write historical fiction, for instance, William Ospina, they can open up new perspectives on issues on conquest and invasion, but those perspectives are still very Western. In fact, when he was asked about his 4 favorite writers, Ospina, he chose 4 European ones, 2 of them British. So it is very difficult to come face to face with our own value system. But I did encounter a way of doing that, you know, even it's not my own way. But while I was reading this book, I came across something that I didn't know, that Carl Jung, when he visited the United States, he actually met Antonio Mirabal, who's actually, his name is Okia Biano. And he had a talk with him because he wanted to know what it was like. And that's him there. So he met the chieftain and he asked him whether the chieftain asked Carl Jung whether it was not obvious to the white man that the sun was God. Worshipping the sun, added the chieftain, was of benefit to everyone, including the Americans who wanted the practice abolished. Now, quaint as such notions may have appeared to Western minds a few centuries ago, we may be more willing to listen now with issues of climate change. But the magic of such ideas conceals aspects of our lives that science has occluded, aspects that perhaps should never have been relegated to the status of magic, but could instead have been retained within our funds of knowledge. Jung recollects the encounter. So these are the actual exchange between Jung and Oceano. For the first time, I had the good fortune to meet him. See, Oceano Biano said, how cruel the white looks. Their lips are thin, their nose is sharp, their faces furrowed and distorted by folds. Their eyes have a staring expression. They are always seeking something. What are they seeking? The whites always want something. They are always uneasy and restless. We do not know what they want. We do not understand them. We think they are mad. I asked him why he thought the whites were all mad. They say that they think with their heads, he replied. Why, of course. What do you think with? I asked him in surprise. We think here, he said, indicating his heart. So Jung goes on, I fell into a long meditation. For the first time in my life, so it seemed to me, someone had drawn for me a picture of the real white man. Now, real, inasmuch as it was from a different perspective only, non-white, colonized, marginalized, etc. A perspective that would have been impossible for Jung to experience himself. In a way, Okia Biano was describing the colonial gaze, dissatisfaction with one's lot, a distorted search for something better, greater, more powerful, and a disregard for others and their difference, implicit in the absence of the heart in thinking. So thinking with one's heart entails the body in nature, which includes others. What feels right becomes part of thinking well. The Western mind calls here for caution, lest we succumb to sentimentalism and indiscriminate compassion. So Chowdhury praises anthropological magical realism in its disarming nature and its use a trickster's ruse to, as the critical theorist Spivak might phrase, uncoercively rearrange the manner in which nationalist readers are trained to think. In his encounter with the chieftain, Carl Jung certainly appears disarmed. He is placed in front of a mirror that forces him to reflect. But there is no trickster's ruse here, only actual experience. Jung's extensive understanding of the historicity of human nature, and particularly his interest in Eastern philosophy, does not make him the typical Western reader that Chowdhury has in mind. The rational reader and the empiricist in the latter case are classical examples embodying Western conceptions of knowledge, defining how things are, ought to be for everyone, where science and positivism in particular dictate how we ought to understand and navigate the world, and where anything outside our realm of explanations and articulation is reduced to the magical. For Jung, In place of reducing such cultural differences to the realm of the magic, he saw the dignity of the individual Indian as founded on their lives being cosmologically meaningful. Jung saw Westerners' lives as limited and impoverished in that respect, although still superior. So are we with Jung here? And although magical realism can help us approach a text differently, other people's ways of being is not a magical story. The gaze of empire makes us position what perplexes us as being outside objective experience or in opposition to Western empirical conceptions of truth and reality, relegating the reality of others to the realm of dreams and fantasy. I doubt that indigenous communities thought or think of their relation to the world as magical in terms of not being part of their daily experience. Thus, when we bring magical realism to the Western educational context, as I have often done, we must remember that we are only passing the ball, the same perspective on what counts for real knowledge, from one empire to another. The question is, how do we, or can we, really blow the whistle and stop mid-gain in our own practice? It seems to me that the ever finer channels of control do not allow for the possibility of crying foul. We disqualify those who appraise our practice negatively if we deem them lacking rigorous foundations for doing so. For what is rigorous, for example, about thinking with one's heart? We cannot measure the heart's influence, for better or for worse, in our actions, but we can speak in terms of our moral conduct and duties towards ourselves and others. The subject knowledge of decolonization, thus, resides in unpicking what the latter consideration entails, particularly when considering cultures that have been marginalized by empires. This implies critical reflection, accepting that having the ball thrown at us from unexpected directions will unsettle us and hurt us even, will be part of the course, but it may unveil the gaze of the empire within us. At the personal level, its finer channels, forcing us to look at ourselves in our practice anew, and taming our ways of knowing, that we may gain genuinely new perspectives. Now, not all indigenous languages and cultures were decimated in the Americas. For instance, listen to this. Okay, so the quote above expresses the link between language and identity. The fact that language and national or communal identity are linked serves both the conqueror in his efforts to subdue and the conquered in his efforts to emancipate. However, those ever finer channels of power, that's me and you, because we are acting on behalf of the empire. I often say to my students, I am acting on behalf of the empire because I am here in England, so I have to sustain those values. So those ever finer channels of power instantiated through educational system, but ultimately through individual persons, amount to a formidable fortress around the empire. When such a system consigns indigenous languages and the identities contained therein to oblivion, is emancipation possible at all? For even the clamor against the injustice and violence that indigenous communities, who now constitute most of the poor in South America and Central America, suffered, is phrased in the tongue of the aggressor. How else can the aggressor understand? Cecilia's very own name is in Spanish, is Spanish. South America's greatest writers and poets wrote in Spanish. The highly acclaimed verses from Alturas de Machu Picchu by Pablo Neruda, Sube a nacer conmigo, hermano, and Dorfman said, this poem is about Latin America retold with outrage for the forgotten and violated lives of the myriad and poor and dispossessed, with reference for their dignity and labors. And yet, I think that the real telling lines from Neruda are more about the annihilation. He talks about, you can read that, you won't return from the depths of the rocks, you won't return from subterranean time, neither will your hardened voice return, nor will your drilled out eyes. Although there may be some poetic reverence in Dorfman's statement, I find that the most telling lies in Neruda verses are those betraying a cry of annihilation, the imperial event horizon from which nothing returns, Machu Picchu, like all empires, rose through the blood of the countless slaves and workers who forged it, just like Chilean colonial wealth rises through the workers in the Atacama Desert that you can see there. Just a quick note on there on what it means to be a mixture of people, okay? And what the mestizo means. And this is really relevant for anybody who is talking to people who come from the Americas. The connotation of the word Indian is really heavily and very negative when you say to somebody, you look like an Indian. It's very offensive to somebody because of all this historical wealth. If we don't know about it, we'll be causing offense to someone, okay? And then, of course, we have, these are the Mapuche, and this is Arauco. And there's a huge problems in Chile at the moment with this. But we have here people, I know, maybe they look like me. I'm one of them, okay? We are Chileans, we are Mapuche. And of course, because so many problems say, I am Mapuche, I am not a terrorist. So centuries of believing that to be civilized meant to be more Spanish or European-like have engendered a sort of identity dysmorphia in its people, who do not identify with nor favor indigenous features and ways of being. A walk along a high street in Santiago will seldom show ads portraying indigenous actors. Caucasian beauty canons are portrayed and projected, fake mirrors which both hide and illuminate the tragedy of colonization. Now, poetry is the one thing where there is some resistance. And that's important because Foucault was looking at, well, where is power hiding? You need to look at where resistance is hiding. And not just poetry, but the arts in general are one of the ways where people actually express resistance. So it's one of the most salient art forms in Mapuche culture, and it's an oral tradition. So it's already on the back foot because, for Western tradition, if it's not written, it's not there. Elikura, his name, a celebrated Mapuche poet, refers to, in one of his verses, to a key that no one lost and that therefore no one will ever find. I interpret his lines as signifying the key to the reemergence of the Mapuche culture, a key which is not to be found or recovered by anyone, let alone Chilean poets or activists in the Spanish tongue. The latter can only be witnessed to the Mapuche people's own recovered history. Elikura also writes in Mapudungun when he wishes to do so. He uses the Spanish as an instrument of expression, which serves a good purpose. So thus seen, okay, so the languages as the remain of the empire and its very foundation. So as Chileans, we're always in between these, okay? How might Neruda's poetry be different from Elikura's in terms of who speaks for whom? If identity is inextricably linked to language, then voice does matter. As Hook said in her poem, language calls us to remember and mourn, to know again that as we work for change, our struggle is also a struggle of memory against forgetting. So the struggle of memory in Neruda's case, historically placed, cannot be the same as Elikura. Because whereas Neruda's clamor against injustice as the foundations of the empire, Elikura has only the empire's remains. He wants to make a case with Spanish, rather than just enjoy the flavor of Spanish. As a Chilean citizen, myself, for instance, the Spanish tongue seems to have always run through my veins, being both the remains and the foundations of the empire. How then, under such circumstances, could anyone bring up the idea that perhaps Spanish is not our language after all? Who is the we in that thought other than the conqueror's mestizo child, the hybrid individual? Because all children want to belong to their most admired parent. The cultural and racial mix of the indigenous person produces a troubled ancestral identity, for we do not know who we were. Our indigenous ancestry cannot be traced by kinship, but only geographically through impersonal DNA analysis that tells us nothing about who we are, because for the empire, we never were anybody worthy of keeping records for. So all these lead us to think about, how do we reflect about this issue? So I use Yancey in relation to writing studies. Yancey conceptualizes the characteristics and features of effective reflection in what she calls a rhetoric of reflection. So this is an epistemological value of and practice. I extrapolate Yancey's ideas in what I would add is the necessary and precursory notion of humans as reflective beings who have the capacity not only to think and write, but to be, in essence, reflective. As such, when considering decolonization strategies in education, the question of epistemological value and practice is a necessary one, meant to make us challenge our assumptions around knowledge, how we construct it, how aspects of it we do in our practice. This can produce an unsettledness that we ought to be willing to experience, to be thrown off balance, can give us new perspectives. For instance, we can become unsettled when confronted by someone else's different use of our language. As such, we can make them feel that their tools of expression appear deficient, inaccessible, jarring, or simply inadequate. And the relationship to difference, the enactment of feeling different to expected educational norms, the feelings that we do not belong to the community that we find ourselves in or are addressing. So when we question our views and practice, we are in a better position to explore how the imperial gaze works through our institutions, a gaze that we, its finer channels, defend. In this sense, we are the subject knowledge of decolonization, our values concerning what counts as knowledge and success. However, is it possible to abandon the gaze of empire when it is the only gaze we have ever known? You know, admittedly, change has never come easily to education, okay? Never has been easy to change things in a big institution. The idea of challenging the Goliath of Western institutions, like universities, can be disempowering and demoralizing. Some ethnic minorities prefer to compartmentalize their lives and submit to the traditions of universities rather than contesting them. To challenge the imperial gaze, we need what Yancey refers to as that epistemological reflection that unsettles us. To be capable of contemplating that something different could be of equal or greater value is tantalizing. What would it mean, for instance, to uphold the idea that excellence can only be found in genuine collaboration? And not disguised competition, that conceptions of knowledge must include human intuitions, thinking with the heart, because of the incommensurability of human experience. Now, Violeta Parra, she's a songstress in Chile, and she traveled the whole length of Chile collecting the folklore of that of those regions. Nobody had ever done that before. So the kind of music that she brought to Chile was very different. And in particularly, I like one line of hers, that she talks about what our feelings can comprehend, our knowledge has yet to imagine. So things that we can feel, we cannot always put to words. What happens is that usually the Western empires believe that if you cannot put it into words, it just doesn't exist. And that's where the problem is. They do exist, but how do we measure these things? And you can hear it. So to conclude, the word I have challenged here is decolonization. As I have suggested, it sets us off on a fool's errand because the home of the empire cannot be decolonized. We need to gaze at the empire rather than at the colony, and cover the empire from its cozy slumber so that we may confront its gaze. To ignore it is to sanitize the idea of those past empires because it allows us to move on and turn the page on them as if they were a thing of the past. Ignoring the empire within makes us think of decolonization as something related to performance. It disassociates us at a fundamental level of reflection by joining us at the peripheral level of actions. The colonial gaze is a symptom that persists under the careful gaze of the empire without serving as its finer channels. This is a subject knowledge of decolonization, which is in no way restricted to foreign language learning, and which is not to be found in a textbook or a resource, but in the personal values that sustain that gaze. And anyone willing to be unsettled is up for the challenge. I have not argued here for the banishment of Western post-imperial languages. There is much we can learn from the arts and literatures, even imperial ones. As an example, we could argue that to hope for radical change in higher education is a quixotic venture. But having met Don Quixote, I am energized by the acquaintance and understand the challenge it entails. I only argue here for a more radical critique of what decolonization really means and necessitates, one that challenges the decisions that governments, universities, schools, teachers, and we ourselves take on behalf of an educational good. The hope is to awaken a conscientiousness of what it is that we are really doing when we, for instance, uncritically embrace the languages of Western empires in the context of a rhetoric of decolonization. Fin.
Well, thank you very much. The usual procedure, a few minutes in pairs or threes, whatever suits you best.